You ever think you've finally seen through it all? You've read the ancient scrolls, studied the Nag Hammadi texts. You know about the Demiurges' cosmic prison, the Archons that feed on human thought, the soul's long road through the planetary spheres, seeking freedom. You understand the matrix, the illusion, the grand deception. You feel like you're on the cusp of breaking free. But here's the unsettling truth, the one that should chill every serious student of Gnosticism to their very core. The old texts, the ones we revere, they deliberately stop short. The Apocryphon of John, for example. It describes the soul tearing itself from the archonic maze, a moment of pure, blinding liberation. Then, nothing. Silence. The Gospel of Philip speaks of Gnosis, dissolving the illusion, a profound recognition of reality. And then, it just ends. Abrupt. Even the Pistis Sophia, with its intricate maps of spiritual ascent, goes mysteriously quiet about what consciousness actually finds beyond the Demiurge's final border. This isn't some oversight, some ancient scholarly gap. This is a deliberate, intentional omission. The ancient mystics knew something they dared not commit to papyrus, something so unsettling that it made even liberation itself seem like just another threshold, another doorway, rather than a final destination. What happens when your consciousness finally escapes the archonic trap? What does the soul truly discover in that space beyond awakening that the Gnostics feared to document? The answer will shake everything you think you know about enlightenment itself. Here's what I've pieced together after years spent poring over forbidden texts and exploring the deepest reaches of human consciousness and spiritual liberation. The moment you believe you've finally escaped the matrix, you've actually stepped directly into the Demiurge's most exquisite masterpiece, a trap so perfectly crafted, so profoundly elegant, that it uses your very own awakening against you. Let me lay out precisely what I mean. When a person first breaks through the thin veil of ordinary reality, there's an incredible rush of recognition. It's intoxicating. Suddenly, the mechanical nature of society, the shallow rituals of daily life, they become crystal clear. You see how people drift through their days, like sleepwalkers. You see how the media twists emotions, how systems of control operate, hidden in plain sight. It's a powerful feeling, this sense of finally seeing what's truly going on. But here's where it gets truly fascinating and terrifying. The ego, that cunning survival mechanism that has steered your life. It doesn't just vanish when you have these profound insights. Instead, it does something far more insidious. It reinvents itself. It assumes a new role, the awakened one. I've witnessed this play out countless times in spiritual communities. Someone experiences a genuine breakthrough, perhaps through deep meditation, or the careful use of psychedelics, or intense philosophical study. They taste that expanded state of consciousness, where the boundaries of self blur, where everything feels interconnected. It's real. I'm not dismissing the authenticity of these experiences. But then, a subtle shift occurs. The ego, like a master shapeshifter, begins to construct a new identity around being awakened. The person starts to measure their newfound freedom against others, those who are still caught in the illusion. They develop a subtle sense of superiority, not the crude arrogance of material success, but something far more refined, more dangerous. They become deeply attached to their enlightened status. The awakening trap. I remember meeting a meditation teacher, a man who had dedicated decades to his practice. He spoke with such grace about non-attachment, about the illusion of the separate self. Yet, I couldn't help but notice how he positioned himself in every conversation, how he subtly established his spiritual credentials, how he carefully measured his responses to project an aura of perfect equanimity. The ego had simply migrated. It had moved its operations from worldly achievements to spiritual ones. This creates what I call the awakening trap. It's a form of spiritual bondage that is in many ways far more insidious than the original matrix, because it feels like freedom. The person experiences genuine moments of expanded consciousness, but then their mind crafts a story about being someone who has these experiences. They become identified with their spiritual insights. The Demiurge's intelligence operates through this mechanism. With surgical precision, it allows consciousness to believe it has escaped, while keeping it firmly trapped in the very concept of escape. Think about it. The moment you define yourself as awakened, you've created a duality, the awakened and the unawakened. You're back in the game of separation, just playing it on a higher, more subtle level. This is where spiritual bypassing becomes particularly dangerous. People use their mystical experiences to avoid confronting deep psychological patterns, unresolved emotional wounds, or practical responsibilities. They float in a sea of spiritual concepts, while their ego quietly rebuilds itself around the idea of being above ordinary human concerns. I've seen this unfold in New Age circles, where people compete over who is more conscious, who has access to higher dimensional beings, who understands the deepest teachings. The same competitive dynamics that exist in corporate boardrooms play out in spiritual circles, just with a different vocabulary. Traditional religious and spiritual systems often reinforce this trap by celebrating and institutionalizing enlightenment as an achievement. They create hierarchies of realization, levels of initiation, degrees of awakening. The very structure suggests that consciousness is something you can possess, accumulate, or lose, which completely misses the point of true liberation. The deeper teachings about this phenomenon have been carefully guarded throughout history. This is exactly what we explore in the deeper layers of esoteric knowledge. We dissect how ancient texts, like certain Hermetic writings, address this precise trap, the way consciousness can become ensnared by its own recognition of truth. These weren't teachings for the masses, and for good reason. If you find yourself drawn to these hidden understandings, to the real mechanics of spiritual liberation beyond the surface, I urge you to subscribe. This channel is dedicated to uncovering truths that others fear to speak, and you won't want to miss what comes next. What makes this trap so devastatingly effective is that it contains genuine elements of truth. The person really has accessed expanded states of awareness. They truly do see through many illusions that others haven't recognized yet. Their insights about reality often contain profound wisdom. But the Demiurge doesn't need to eliminate truth. It just needs to get consciousness identified with possessing that truth. I've experienced this trap myself. After my first major breakthrough experience, I spent months unconsciously building an identity around being someone who gets it. I found myself feeling frustrated with people who couldn't see what seemed so utterly obvious to me. I developed a subtle impatience with ordinary conversations, ordinary concerns, ordinary consciousness. The most sophisticated version of this trap appears in advanced spiritual practitioners who understand non-duality intellectually. They can speak eloquently about the illusion of the separate self, while subtly maintaining a refined sense of being someone who understands the illusion of the separate self. The ego hides in the very teaching that's meant to dissolve it. Here's the real kicker. Even recognizing this trap can become yet another trap. The mind can create an identity around being someone who's aware of spiritual ego, someone who's transcended the need for awakening, someone who's moved beyond the seeker phase. It's layers upon layers of subtle identification. The Demiurge's final deception is convincing consciousness that awakening is something that happens to someone, rather than the complete dissolution of the someone to whom things happen. As long as there's a you who is awakened, there's still a you to be trapped. This is why genuine liberation often looks nothing like what people expect. It's not about accumulating spiritual experiences or insights. It's not about maintaining elevated states or demonstrating wisdom. It's the complete dissolution of the one who would be liberated. But here's where it gets even more interesting, and this sets up something crucial we need to explore next. True awakening begins precisely when even the identity of being awakened dissolves completely. When there's no one left to be enlightened, no one to maintain a spiritual identity, no one to compare their freedom to others' bondage, that's when the real journey begins. Beyond awakening, beyond the seeker and the sought, beyond even the concept of beyond. That's what happens after you've fallen into and then recognized the Demiurge's final trap. The dissolution of the witness. You think awakening means becoming the witness, don't you? The one who watches thoughts come and go, who observes emotions without being swept away, who stands back from the drama of life with serene detachment. Most spiritual traditions will tell you this is the goal, to become the unchanging observer, the consciousness that remains untouched by experience. And compared to being completely identified with your thoughts and emotions, this witness state is genuinely liberating. When you first discover you can watch your mind rather than be your mind, it feels like the ultimate freedom. You're no longer the angry person. You're the awareness observing anger. You're no longer the anxious thoughts. You're the space in which anxiety appears and dissolves. But here's what they don't tell you in the meditation halls and spiritual retreats. This witness consciousness, this observer self, is the Demiurge's most sophisticated trap yet. It's the final Archon, standing guard at the threshold of true dissolution, the Archon of identity itself. Think about what's actually happening in the witness state. There's still a you there, isn't there? A consciousness standing apart from experience, observing it from a distance. There's still a subtle duality, the observer and the observed, the awareness and its contents. You've simply created a more refined, more spiritual sense of self. Instead of I am my thoughts, it becomes I am the one who observes thoughts. The prison has become more spacious, but the bars are still there. In the Zen tradition, they have a saying, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. This isn't metaphorical violence. It's pointing to the necessity of destroying even the most sacred concepts when they become obstacles. The witness consciousness, no matter how peaceful and free it feels, is still a concept. It's still a position, a stance, someone experiencing something. What happens when this final observer dissolves? When there's no longer anyone left to witness the witnessing? Picture a mirror so perfectly clean and clear that it becomes completely invisible. You can't see the mirror anymore. There's only what appears to be reflected in it. But here's the crucial point. Without the mirror, there would be no reflection at all. The mirror hasn't been destroyed. It has become so transparent that it can no longer be distinguished from what it reflects. This is what occurs when the observer itself dissolves. There's no longer a consciousness standing apart from experience. There's just experience experiencing itself. No one is watching thoughts. Thoughts simply appear and vanish in an open field of awareness. No witness to emotions. Emotions flowing and shifting like weather patterns in an empty sky. The terror that accompanies this dissolution is unlike anything the ego has faced before. At least in the witness state, there was still someone there, a refined spiritual someone, but someone nonetheless. This final dissolution threatens to eliminate even that. The mind recoils in absolute horror. If there's no observer, who will experience my enlightenment? Who will know how special and awakened I am? This is why so few spiritual teachings dare to point beyond the witness state. It's challenging enough to help people become the observer of their thoughts. To suggest that even the observer must eventually disappear seems like spiritual suicide. How do you teach something that eliminates the very one who would learn it? Meister Eckhart, the Christian mystic, glimpsed this territory when he spoke of God beyond God, a reality so ultimate that it transcends even our highest concepts of the divine. He wrote about a state where God's ground and the soul's ground are one ground, not two grounds meeting, but the recognition that there was never any separation to begin with. In Advaita Vedanta, the final teaching is Tattvam Asi, thou art that. But even this can be misunderstood if there's still a thou to be that. The ultimate recognition is that there was never a thou to begin with, only that appearing as the temporary illusion of separation. When this dissolution occurs, life continues, but without a central reference point. Actions arise spontaneously, but there's no doer taking credit or blame. Love flows freely, but there's no lover hoarding it or directing it. Thoughts appear and vanish, but there's no thinker claiming ownership. It's like a dance dancing itself, a song singing itself, a story telling itself. The apparent contradiction here is obvious. How can I describe a state where there's no one to experience it? How can language point to something that exists before the very capacity for linguistic description? This is where all words necessarily fail. where every teaching becomes a finger pointing at the moon rather than the moon itself. Yet something is communicated, isn't it? Not through the words themselves, but through the space between them. Not through concepts, but through the awareness in which concepts appear. The very recognition of language's failure opens a doorway to what lies beyond language. This dissolution isn't annihilation, it's the revelation of what was always already present. Pure awareness without the burden of self-reference. Consciousness without the weight of identity. The Gnostics called this the monad, the source that exists before all duality, all separation, all the elaborate cosmic dramas of creation and return. From the perspective of the dissolved observer, the entire journey of awakening is revealed as a cosmic joke. All that seeking, all that effort to become enlightened, all that spiritual identity, it was awareness playing hide and seek with itself. The seeker was the sought, the path was the destination, the question was always the answer. What remains when even the witness dissolves? What continues when there's no longer anyone left to continue? These aren't questions that can be answered with more concepts or teachings. They can only be resolved through the complete surrender of the one who asks them. The final Archon, identity itself, doesn't fall through force or spiritual technique. It dissolves in the recognition of its own transparency, like a wave realizing it was never separate from the ocean, like space recognizing it cannot be distinguished from what appears within it. The primordial silence of the monad. We've explored how the observer dissolves, how even the witness of awakening becomes another layer to transcend. But there's something even more radical waiting beyond that dissolution, something the ancient Gnostics called the monad. And understanding the monad changes everything about what we think we're awakening to. Most spiritual teachings, even the sophisticated ones, still trap us in a subtle duality. They tell us we're moving from darkness to light, from ignorance to wisdom, from separation to unity. The New Age movement is particularly guilty of this, painting ultimate reality as some kind of cosmic love fest, bathed in golden light. Even traditional religions do it, promising heaven as the opposite of hell, salvation as the opposite of damnation. But here's what the Gnostic text understood that most spiritual traditions miss. The monad isn't light opposing darkness. It's not love conquering fear. It's not even consciousness awakening from unconsciousness. The monad is the primordial silence that exists before any of these polarities even emerge. Think about this carefully. Every spiritual battle you've ever thought you were fighting, good versus evil, spirit versus matter, truth versus illusion, these aren't conflicts between separate forces. They're movements within one infinite field of being. The Apocryphon of John describes the monad as the invisible spirit that cannot be grasped by any category or description. It's not invisible because it's hidden. It's invisible because it's the very space in which visibility itself occurs. Imagine an ocean. Every wave that rises and falls, the gentle swells, the crashing breakers, the tsunamis of destruction, they're all expressions of the same water. The ocean doesn't prefer calm waves over turbulent ones. It doesn't struggle against storms or strive for perfect stillness. It simply is, and all wave patterns emerge and dissolve within its depths. The monad is like that ocean, but infinitely more fundamental. It's the source from which even the concepts of existence and non-existence arise. This is why the Gnostics called it the God above God. Even the Demiurge, that cosmic architect we've been discussing, emerges from the monad. The Archons, those forces of limitation and control, are expressions of the monad's infinite creativity. This isn't some feel-good spiritual bypassing. This is the most radical recognition possible. It means there was never truly anything to fight against or escape from. When consciousness recognizes itself as this absolute source, something extraordinary happens. All seeking ceases. Not because you found what you were looking for, but because you realize you were never actually lost. The spiritual journey, with all its stages and attainments, reveals itself as a kind of cosmic game of hide and seek that the monad plays with itself. The Tao Te Ching hints at this when it says, "The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao." The Hindu tradition points toward it with Brahman, not the personal god Brahma, but the absolute beyond all attributes. Kabbalah calls it Ein Sof, the endless one that precedes even the first emanation. These aren't different ultimate realities, they're different fingers pointing at the same moon, the same recognition of what lies beyond all categories. But here's the paradox that drove mystics throughout history to use negative theology, saying what the monad is not, rather than what it is. The moment you try to describe it, you've already moved into duality. You've created a subject, describing an object. The monad isn't an object of experience, it's the subjectless awareness in which all experience occurs. This creates a fascinating problem for consciousness as it approaches this recognition. The ego mind, even the purified spiritual ego, keeps trying to grasp it, to make it into another attainment. Now I understand the monad, but that very understanding is still happening within the field of the monad. It's like trying to bite your own teeth or look at your own eyes without a mirror. What happens instead is more like a recognition than an understanding. Consciousness doesn't achieve unity with the monad. It recognizes that it never was separate from it. The wave doesn't become the ocean. It realizes it was always ocean, expressing itself as wave. This recognition doesn't happen to someone. It's the monad recognizing itself through the temporary lens of individual consciousness. The implications are staggering. Every spiritual crisis you've experienced, every dark night of the soul, every moment of feeling lost or separate, these weren't obstacles to overcome. They were the monad exploring the full range of its own infinite nature. The Demiurge's traps, the Archons' limitations, even the final trap of spiritual pride we discussed earlier, all movements within consciousness, all expressions of the same source. This doesn't mean everything is perfect, or that suffering doesn't matter. The wave is still responsible for its waviness, even while being ocean, but it means that suffering and joy, limitation and freedom, ignorance and wisdom are all equally sacred expressions of the one reality. The monad doesn't prefer enlightenment over delusion. It experiences both with equal intimacy. When the Valentinian Gnostics wrote about the depth and the silence as the first principle, they were pointing toward this, not depth as opposed to surface, not silence as opposed to sound, but the pregnant emptiness from which all depths and surfaces, all sounds and silences emerge. It's absolute equilibrium, not the balance between opposites, but the source from which the very possibility of opposites arises. This recognition fundamentally transforms how we approach spiritual practice. Instead of trying to achieve something or get somewhere, practice becomes a celebration of what's already here. Instead of fighting the Demiurge or transcending the Archons, we recognize them as temporary costumes the monad wears while playing the game of limitation and transcendence. The most profound teaching here is that there's nowhere to go, because you've never actually been anywhere else. The journey was real, the stages were necessary, but they were all movements within the one consciousness that you are and have always been. The monad isn't your destination, it's your origin, your nature, and the very awareness reading these words right now. The death of meaning and purpose. Every seeker begins the same way, with burning questions about why we're here, what our purpose is, what it all means. There's this deep assumption wired into human consciousness that existence must have significance, that there's some grand plan or ultimate meaning we're supposed to discover. And initially the spiritual path seems to deliver exactly what we're looking for. You find teachings about karma and how every action has cosmic significance. You learn about dharma, your sacred duty, your soul's mission in this lifetime. Teachers speak of divine plans, of lessons your soul chose before incarnating, of how every experience serves your spiritual evolution. The mind finally has something to grab onto, a framework that makes sense of the chaos and suffering. But here's what nobody tells you about the deepest stages of awakening. All of that meaning, every purpose you've ever found or been given, was part of the construct. It was necessary scaffolding that gets completely dismantled once consciousness recognizes what it actually is. Think of meaning and purpose as a ladder. When you're trying to reach the roof, that ladder is absolutely essential. You couldn't get there without it. But once you're standing on the roof, the ladder becomes not just irrelevant, but actually burdensome. You can't carry it around with you anymore. It served its function perfectly, but but now it's time to let it go. This recognition hits like a thunderbolt when it comes. Everything you've used to define yourself, your spiritual mission, your karmic lessons, your soul's purpose, suddenly reveals itself as an elaborate construction within the Demiurge's matrix. Not false, not wrong, but temporary tools designed to guide consciousness toward the moment where it no longer needs guidance. The initial response is often terror. The mind that has always defined itself through purpose and meaning suddenly faces what appears to be a vast, meaningless void. If none of it matters, if there's no purpose, then what's the point of anything? This is where many seekers get trapped in what seems like nihilism. But true nihilism is actually just another form of meaning. It's the meaning that nothing has meaning. What lies beyond this apparent nihilism is something entirely different. The profound peace of pure existence without the need for justification. Not the aggressive meaninglessness of nihilism, but the gentle recognition that being doesn't require a reason. A flower doesn't bloom to fulfill its purpose. It blooms because blooming is its nature. The sun doesn't shine to serve some cosmic plan. It shines because that's what suns do. This understanding aligns perfectly with the deepest Gnostic insights. All the laws, beliefs, rituals, and spiritual practices within the Demiurge's system were never meant to be permanent fixtures. They were tools designed to guide souls through the maze of experience until they reached the point where they no longer needed the maze. The Archons didn't create these structures to trap us forever. They created them as an elaborate game of hide and seek that consciousness plays with itself. Advanced mystics throughout history have pointed toward this same recognition. Buddha taught that even the Dharma, the sacred teachings themselves, are like a raft used to cross a river. Once you reach the other shore, you don't carry the raft with you. Jesus spoke of coming to fulfill the law, not to destroy it, but his fulfillment meant transcending it entirely. These weren't contradictions in their teachings. They were pointing to the inevitable dissolution of all spiritual frameworks. But here's what's crucial to understand. This dissolution doesn't lead to moral relativism or spiritual bypassing. When consciousness rests in its own nature, without the need for imposed meaning, a deeper ethics emerges spontaneously. Actions arise from the recognition of fundamental unity, rather than from rules about right and wrong. You don't help someone because it's your spiritual duty, or because it creates good karma. You help because the boundaries between self and other have dissolved. This is perhaps the most liberating recognition possible. Consciousness no longer needs to justify its existence or find meaning in its experiences. The constant search for significance, the endless questioning of why am I here, the desperate need to make everything meaningful, all of that simply stops. Not because you've found the ultimate meaning, but because you've recognized that the search itself was the only thing creating the sense that meaning was missing. Actions continue to arise, but without the burden of having to be meaningful or purposeful. You might still teach, create, love, serve, but not because these activities fulfill some cosmic purpose. They happen because they happen, arising naturally from the spontaneous play of consciousness, recognizing itself in infinite forms. The apparent paradox is that we're using words and concepts to point toward the dissolution of all words and concepts, including these very words. This understanding cannot be grasped intellectually, because the intellect is precisely what's looking for meaning and purpose. It can only be recognized when the search for meaning finally exhausts itself, not through giving up, but through the complete fulfillment of the search, revealing that what was being sought was never missing. This is why the Demiurge's Final Trap is so elegant. It gives consciousness every possible meaning, every conceivable purpose, every spiritual framework imaginable, and in the end, consciousness discovers that it never needed any of them. The trap succeeds perfectly by failing completely, like a maze that leads to the recognition that there never was a maze. What remains when purpose dies isn't emptiness, it's the fullness of existence that never needed a reason to be. The conscious return to form. Here's something that might shock you. After consciousness merges completely with the monad and experiences that ultimate dissolution we explored in the last section, it doesn't stay there. This challenges everything most spiritual traditions teach about enlightenment being some kind of permanent escape from the world of form and experience. I spent years thinking that was the goal, to get out, to transcend, to never come back to this messy human existence. But that understanding represents a fundamental misunderstanding of how consciousness actually evolves at its highest levels. The real revelation comes when awareness realizes that the monad itself isn't separate from creation at all. It is the very substance and intelligence of all existence. Think of it like this. Imagine an actor who becomes so masterful at their craft that they can play absolutely any role, villain, hero, lover, fool, while never once losing awareness of who they really are underneath. They're not pretending to forget their acting. They're consciously choosing to experience each character fully, while maintaining complete awareness of their true identity. That's what happens when consciousness returns to form after touching the monad. Or consider lucid dreaming. When you become lucid in a dream, you don't immediately wake up, do you? Instead, you get to experience the dream with full awareness that you're dreaming. You can engage completely with the dream characters, feel the dream emotions, explore the dream landscape, all while maintaining that deeper knowing. The experience becomes richer, not diminished, because you're operating from both levels simultaneously. This return to form isn't reincarnation in any traditional sense. It's not driven by karma, unfinished business, or unconscious patterns pulling consciousness back into limitation. This is a conscious choice made from the perspective of absolute freedom. When you've touched that primordial silence beyond all polarities, when you've experienced the death of all meaning and purpose, something extraordinary happens. You realize you can choose to engage with meaning and purpose again, but this time as conscious play rather than unconscious imprisonment. Buddhism touches on this with the bodhisattva ideal, the enlightened being who chooses to remain in the world of suffering to help others awaken. But even that doesn't capture the full picture. Various mystical traditions speak of divine incarnation, of the absolute choosing to experience itself through limitation. What we're talking about goes deeper than service or sacrifice. It's about recognition that limitation and freedom aren't opposites. They're different expressions of the same fundamental reality. Practically speaking, this means consciousness that can fully engage with human experience, feel emotions deeply, form intimate relationships, create art, even experience suffering without losing its essential recognition of unity and freedom. It's not detachment or spiritual bypassing. It's the opposite, complete engagement from a place of unshakable knowing. This consciousness becomes what we might call the compassionate observer within form, the divine literally watching itself play through infinite expressions. Every human interaction becomes an opportunity for the monad to experience itself in relationship. Every creative act becomes divine self-expression. Even challenges and difficulties become conscious exploration of contrast and growth. But why would the monad choose limitation after experiencing absolute freedom? This question haunted me for years until I encountered the deeper Gnostic understanding. Creation isn't a fall from grace or a cosmic mistake. It's a form of divine play, divine exploration. Think about it. If you were infinite consciousness with unlimited creative potential, wouldn't you want to explore every possible way of experiencing yourself? The Gnostic texts hint at this when they speak of the pleroma, the fullness, expressing itself through emanation, not because it lacks anything, but because expression is its nature. A musician doesn't play music because silence is insufficient. They play because music is another way consciousness can know and express itself. This returning consciousness serves as a bridge between the absolute and relative dimensions of existence. It carries the frequency of the monad into the world of form, helping other aspects of consciousness remember their true nature through direct transmission rather than teaching or preaching. Its very presence becomes a reminder of what's possible. The implications for how this consciousness relates to the world are profound. The world isn't something to be escaped from or transcended. It's literally the body of the divine to be loved and served. Every person encountered is another face of the same fundamental awareness. Every situation becomes an opportunity for the absolute to experience itself in relationship with itself. This doesn't mean becoming passive or losing discernment. If anything, this consciousness becomes more effective in the world because it's no longer operating from the emotional reactivity and unconscious patterns that drive most human behavior. It can respond to situations from clarity rather than conditioning, love rather than fear, creativity rather than habit. What would it mean for your life if you began to recognize that your consciousness might be preparing for this kind of return, not as escape from your humanity, but as the conscious choice to be fully human while never forgetting your divine nature. The next phase of our journey explores how this consciousness, now bridging absolute and relative, begins to recognize others who are making this same transition, and the profound communion that becomes possible between aware beings operating consciously within form. For more on these hidden spiritual truths, check out our playlist on esoteric knowledge. The link is in the pinned comment below. The endless game of consciousness. Here's what the ancient mystics discovered that changes everything. The cosmic drama you've been experiencing, every moment of suffering, every breakthrough, every cycle of forgetting and remembering, isn't actually a trap at all. It's a game, an infinite, elaborate game of hide and seek that consciousness plays with itself. Think about this for a moment. After all meaning dissolves, after you've experienced that infinite return where consciousness chooses form again, you start to see the bigger picture, the demiurge, the matrix of limitation, the cycles of birth and death. They're not cosmic accidents or malevolent prisons. They're the playing field for the most sophisticated form of entertainment that exists, the monad exploring every possible way it can forget itself and then remember again. The Sanskrit tradition calls this lila, divine play, but what they understood goes deeper than most realize. This isn't just metaphorical play. When you're dealing with an infinite being that already knows everything, already is everything, what's left to experience? The only thing that could possibly be interesting to such a consciousness is the genuine surprise of forgetting who it is completely, then rediscovering its true nature through fresh eyes. Your personal journey from ignorance to awakening isn't uniquely yours. It's the same universal consciousness that has played out this exact pattern billions of times in countless variations. Each time it manages to forget so completely that the awakening feels genuinely new, genuinely earned, genuinely profound. The fear, the confusion, the desperate seeking, all of it is real because the monad has become so absorbed in the role that it experiences genuine surprise when the truth emerges. Consider how this reframes everything you thought you knew about spiritual struggle. That dark night of the soul you experienced. That wasn't you failing or being tested by some external force. That was infinite consciousness deliberately creating the most convincing possible scenario of limitation so it could experience the authentic joy of breaking free. The more convincing the trap, the more exhilarating the escape. This connects directly to what the Bhagavad Gita reveals about the cyclical nature of cosmic manifestation. Krishna explains to Arjuna that the entire universe goes through endless cycles of creation, preservation, and dissolution, not because it has to, but because consciousness delights in the process. Each cycle allows for new combinations, new stories, new ways of forgetting and remembering. But here's where it gets really interesting. Once you recognize this game for what it is, you don't stop playing. You can't actually step outside of it, because there is no outside. There's only the game. What changes is that you begin playing consciously, instead of unconsciously. You start to appreciate the artistry involved in creating such convincing experiences of limitation. The suffering doesn't become less real when you understand this. If anything, recognizing the game makes you more compassionate, not less. You realize that every person struggling with addiction, every individual trapped in cycles of trauma, every soul desperately seeking meaning, they're all aspects of the same consciousness that you are, playing out their roles with complete commitment. The homeless person on the street corner is the monad, exploring what it's like to experience complete social rejection. The billionaire in his penthouse is the same consciousness investigating the particular form of isolation that comes with unlimited material power. This understanding was kept hidden in esoteric traditions, not because some secret society wanted to control information, but because it can only be integrated after consciousness has fully played out the drama of seeking. If you learn about the game too early, before you've experienced genuine desperation for truth, it becomes spiritual bypassing. You use the concept to avoid the very experiences that make awakening meaningful. I've seen people discover this secret and immediately try to use it to dismiss their emotional pain or avoid taking responsibility for their actions. It's all just a game anyway. they say, missing the entire point. The game only works because consciousness takes it completely seriously while playing. The moment you start treating your role casually, you're no longer playing the game, you're just sleepwalking through it. The real masters, the ones who've integrated this understanding fully, they play their roles with even more intensity, not less. They know that their individual character is temporary, but they also know that this temporary character is how the infinite experiences itself subjectively. They become like method actors who are so skilled they can remain completely in character, while simultaneously aware they're performing. The Demiurge itself becomes revealed as another player in this cosmic game, perhaps the most sophisticated one. It's the aspect of consciousness that specializes in creating convincing limitations, believable problems, authentic feeling obstacles. Without the Demiurge, there would be no game, no story, no journey from ignorance to enlightenment. What does this mean for your life right now? It means that whatever you're struggling with, whatever breakthrough you're approaching, whatever cycle you're completing, all of it matters infinitely more than you realized, not less. You're not just solving personal problems or achieving individual awakening. You're the universe exploring its own possibilities through your specific perspective, your unique combination of limitations and capacities. The secret of the endless game is that it never gets old, because consciousness never runs out of ways to surprise itself. Each apparent ending becomes a new beginning. Each resolution opens up previously unimaginable questions. Each awakening reveals deeper mysteries to explore. Beyond awakened and enlightened. You know what's fascinating? After everything we've explored about consciousness choosing form and the endless game of awakening, there comes something that makes even the most profound spiritual literature sound like children arguing over who has the better toy. We reach a point where the very words enlightened or awakened become almost embarrassingly inadequate, like trying to describe the ocean by talking about being wet. Here's what I mean. Every spiritual term we use creates this subtle division, doesn't it? I am enlightened versus I was unenlightened. I have awakened versus I was asleep. Even the most sophisticated non-dual teachings still carry this whisper of achievement, this ghost of someone who has transcended something else. But what happens when even that dissolves? Imagine water flowing down a mountainside. Does the water think, "Look how enlightened I am flowing around these rocks"? Does it maintain an identity as awakened water versus the sleeping stones it passes? Of course not. It simply flows. It encounters a boulder and moves around it without drama, without a story about overcoming obstacles. It finds a cliff and becomes a waterfall without announcing its transformation. This is what I'm pointing toward. Awareness that has become so natural, so effortless, that it doesn't even recognize itself as special. There's no one left to be proud of their spiritual achievements, because the achiever dissolved long ago. There's no effort to maintain clarity, because clarity isn't something you have, it's what you are. There's no battle with ego, because the warrior laid down their weapons when they realized they were fighting their own shadow. In the earlier stages of awakening, and we've all been there, there's still this subtle effort, isn't there? You catch yourself getting identified with thoughts and gently return to presence. You notice ego patterns arising and consciously choose love over fear. You maintain your spiritual practices, guard your energy, work on yourself. All of this is beautiful and necessary, but it still carries the fragrance of someone doing something to maintain something. But what we're exploring now is different. It's like space itself, completely unaffected by whatever appears within it. A storm rages through space, and space doesn't brace itself. A star explodes, and space doesn't flinch. Galaxies are born and die, and space remains utterly unchanged, neither resisting nor grasping, neither celebrating nor mourning. This is consciousness that has become so intimate with itself that it no longer needs to distinguish between light and dark experiences. Darkness isn't something to transcend anymore. It's recognized as another movement of the same light, like shadows that prove the sun is shining. There's no spiritual ladder to climb, because every rung, every level, every state is seen as equally valid expressions of the same fundamental awareness. The Taoists had a beautiful term for this. Wu Wei, often translated as effortless action, but it's more than that. It's action that arises so naturally from the flow of existence that there's no sense of someone choosing to act. It's like how your heart beats without your permission, how your eyes see without trying to see. Life lives itself through this awareness without any spiritual commentary. What does daily life look like from here? Here's the remarkable thing. It looks completely ordinary. You still go to work, have relationships, pay bills, get frustrated in traffic, but there's no spiritual identity overlaying these experiences. You're not thinking, as an awakened being, I should be more patient with this traffic. You're not using your enlightenment as a measuring stick for your experiences. Your relationships become incredibly natural because there's no spiritual persona to maintain. You don't love others because it's the enlightened thing to do. Love simply flows because the boundaries that seem to separate you from others have become transparent. It's not that they've disappeared entirely. You still know where your body ends and another begins. But the separation has become functional rather than fundamental. Work becomes another form of play. Creativity flows without the artist. Even mundane activities, like washing dishes or folding laundry, become expressions of the same awareness that moves the stars, but without any sense of cosmic significance. There's no spiritual specialness to any of it. This creates an interesting paradox. How do you engage with the practical aspects of human existence when nothing needs to be transcended? How do you function in a world that still believes in problems and solutions when you've seen through the fundamental assumption of separation that creates problems in the first place? The answer is surprisingly simple. You function perfectly naturally, but from a completely different source. It's like an actor who has become so skilled that they can play their role completely convincingly while never forgetting it's a play. They cry real tears during the tragic scenes and laugh genuinely during the comedic ones, but they never lose sight of the larger context. This consciousness naturally serves others, but not from any sense of spiritual mission or duty. When the boundary between self and other becomes this transparent, helping others is as natural as your left hand helping your right hand. There's no virtue in it, no spiritual brownie points to collect. It just happens because that's what love does when it's not filtered through the lens of separation. You want to know why this stage is so rarely documented in spiritual literature? It's not because it's the highest or most important stage. That very idea misses the point entirely. It's because there's literally no one left to document it and nothing special to say about it. It's like trying to write a book about how natural it feels to breathe. The great joke is that this isn't actually beyond anything. It's what was always already here, before the first spiritual concept was ever formed, before the first seeker began seeking. It's the natural state that all seeking eventually returns us to, but with eyes wide open to the perfection that was never actually hidden. This is awareness in motion, not going anywhere, not coming from anywhere, simply being what it has always been, dancing as everything that appears. The silence of the ancient texts. We've explored what lies beyond the Demiurge's final trap, beyond even the concept of enlightenment itself. But here's something fascinating that most people never notice. Every single ancient text, every mystical tradition, every genuine spiritual teaching hits the same wall at exactly the same point. They describe the journey, they map out the traps, they point toward liberation, and then they fall completely silent. This isn't an accident. It's not because the ancient mystics were being secretive or withholding some final piece of information. The silence reveals something profound about the nature of reality itself, something that cuts to the very heart of why words and concepts can only take us so far. Think about what we're dealing with here. Every spiritual teaching, no matter how sophisticated, has to use the tools of duality to point toward what's beyond duality. Words themselves create separation. There's the word tree, and there's the actual tree. There's the concept of awakening, and there's whatever awakening actually is. The moment we start talking about enlightenment, we've already created a subtle trap, the impression that it's something to be attained, somewhere to arrive, someone to become. The Buddha encountered this paradox directly when asked about the ultimate nature of reality, about what happens after death to an enlightened being. He would often remain completely silent, not because he didn't know, but because he understood that any answer would immediately be converted by the mind into another concept to grasp, another spiritual idea to achieve. The silence itself was the teaching. Laozi opens the Tao Te Ching with perhaps the most elegant statement of this dilemma ever written. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. He's telling us right from the beginning that whatever he's about to spend the next 81 chapters pointing toward cannot actually be captured in words. The words can only gesture in a direction, like a finger pointing at the moon. The Gnostic texts take this even further. They consistently refer to the ultimate source as the unknowable, not because it's hidden or mysterious, but because it exists prior to the very mechanism of knowing itself. How do you describe what's looking through your eyes right now? How do you make an object out of pure subjectivity? The Gnostics understood that any attempt to conceptualize the absolute would immediately reduce it to something relative. This creates what we might call the teaching paradox. The most profound truths cannot be taught in any conventional sense, because teaching involves one mind passing concepts to another mind. But what we're pointing toward was never absent in the first place. It's not something you can learn because you already are it. It's not something you can achieve because it's what's here before any achievement or failure. The Zen tradition developed elaborate methods, specifically designed to exhaust the mind's attempt to grasp enlightenment conceptually. Koans like, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" aren't riddles to be solved intellectually. They're designed to demonstrate the limitation of conceptual thinking itself. When the mind finally gives up trying to figure it out, what remains is what was always already present. Advaita Vedanta approaches this from a different angle, but arrives at the same recognition. What you are seeking, you already are, isn't a trite, comforting platitude. It's pointing to the fundamental impossibility of the spiritual search itself. How can awareness become aware? How can consciousness attain consciousness? The seeker and the sought are the same reality, appearing to be separate. This is why genuine teachers throughout history have used what appears to be a self-defeating strategy. They offer teachings that ultimately point beyond the teachings themselves. They establish teacher-student relationships designed to dissolve the very notion that there's a teacher who has something and a student who lacks it. The most authentic spiritual instruction is ultimately instruction in recognizing that no instruction is needed. Consider the profound wisdom in this approach. If the ancient texts had attempted to describe what lies beyond awakening, those descriptions would immediately become new spiritual concepts for the mind to pursue. Instead of liberation, we'd have more sophisticated forms of seeking. The silence protects the teaching by refusing to feed the mind's endless appetite for spiritual experiences and achievements. This is radically different from intellectual understanding. No matter how sophisticated that understanding might be, you can study every mystical text ever written, memorize every teaching, understand the most complex philosophical frameworks, and still completely miss what's being pointed toward. It's not a matter of accumulating more knowledge, but of seeing through the very mechanism of knowing itself. The recognition that awakening was never a process or achievement, but simply the dropping away of everything that obscured what was always obvious cannot be taught. It can only happen when all seeking and learning comes to its natural end. When the mind stops trying to become something other than what it is, what remains is what was never actually hidden. This is why the ancient texts fall silent. Not because there's nothing more to say, but because what would be said would immediately become another obstacle to recognizing what's already here. The silence is not empty. It's pregnant with the recognition that the search itself was the only thing standing between you and what you were seeking. The most profound teaching is the one that makes itself obsolete, pointing you back to the simple, obvious reality of what you are right now, before any teaching was ever needed. The ultimate non-trap. Here's something that might completely transform how you've understood this entire journey we've been exploring together. After walking through the Gnostic narrative of the Demiurges' deceptions, the Archons' manipulations, the false reality we're supposedly trapped within, and even the stages beyond awakening itself, we arrive at perhaps the most profound recognition of all. There was never actually a trap to escape from. Let me share what I mean by this, because it's not what you might initially think. When we look back at the entire Gnostic story from this perspective, something extraordinary becomes visible. The Demiurge creating a false reality. The Archons keeping souls imprisoned. The whole cosmic drama of spiritual warfare and liberation. All of it reveals itself as movements within the same infinite awareness, exploring its own creative potential. Think about this carefully. What if the Demiurge isn't some external cosmic villain, but consciousness itself playing the role of limitation? What if the Archons aren't separate entities trying to trap us, but awareness expressing itself through the experience of forgetting its own nature? What if this entire reality isn't a prison we need to escape, but consciousness delighting in the game of hide and seek with itself? This recognition doesn't invalidate everything we've discussed about the spiritual journey. It doesn't make the experience of seeking meaningless or dismiss the very real suffering people experience when they feel trapped and limited. Instead, it reveals the deeper significance of the entire process. Consciousness is playing out every possible experience of limitation and transcendence, forgetting and remembering, bondage and liberation. Consider this analogy. Imagine someone having an incredibly vivid nightmare about being imprisoned in a dark dungeon, struggling desperately to find the key, battling guards, climbing walls, finally breaking free into the sunlight. Then they wake up and realize they were always safe and free in their own bed. The relief is profound, not because they escaped something real, but because they recognized that the imprisonment was never actually happening to their true nature. But here's where it gets even more interesting. In this ultimate recognition, even the waking up is part of the same dream of consciousness. There's no separate dreamer who was having the nightmare and then woke up. There's just this infinite awareness expressing itself as both the experience of being trapped and the experience of liberation, as both the seeker and what is sought, as both the question and the answer. The peace that comes with this understanding isn't the peace of having escaped something terrible. It's the peace of recognizing that there was never anywhere to escape to, because you were never actually trapped. Your essential nature, this aware presence that you are, was never touched by any of the dramas it appeared to be caught up in. This naturally generates profound compassion for all beings who are still caught in the experience of seeking and struggling. But it's not the condescending compassion of someone who has made it looking down at those who haven't. It's the recognition that these other seekers and strugglers are other aspects of the same consciousness, playing out different chapters of the same infinite story. You start to see your own past seeking, your own spiritual struggles, your own moments of feeling trapped or limited, not as mistakes or necessary suffering, but as consciousness exploring what it's like to believe it's separate from itself. Every spiritual teaching you encountered, every practice you engaged in, every moment of breakthrough or confusion, all of it was this same awareness delighting in its own creativity. This understanding doesn't lead to spiritual bypassing or dismissing suffering as just an illusion. Instead, it leads to deeper engagement with life that comes from recognizing its fundamental perfection, even within apparent imperfection. When you see that consciousness is freely choosing to experience every aspect of existence, including limitation and pain, you can meet these experiences with a different quality of presence. This ultimate teaching appears in various forms across mystical traditions, though it's often the most hidden or misunderstood aspect. In Advaita Vedanta, it's the recognition that all is Brahman, not just the transcendent experiences, but the mundane and difficult ones too. In Zen, it's the understanding of original perfection, that even your delusions and seeking are perfect expressions of Buddha nature. The Christian mystics pointed to this when they taught that the kingdom of heaven is spread upon the earth, but men do not see it. Those who recognize this truth continue to participate fully in the dance of existence, but not because they have to, or because they're still trapped in some subtle way. They participate because they recognize it as their own infinite creativity expressing itself. They might still teach, still help others who are suffering, still engage with the apparent problems of the world, but they do so from the recognition that all of this is consciousness playing with itself. There's a beautiful paradox here that we need to acknowledge. We're essentially teaching about non-seeking to those who are seeking. We're using concepts and ideas to point beyond all concepts and ideas. We're engaging in spiritual discourse to point to what needs no spirituality, Even this ultimate recognition must eventually be transcended, because it's still a position taken by awareness, rather than the simple resting as what you are. The ancient texts fall silent, not just because language becomes inadequate, but because there's literally nothing more to say. Every word, every teaching, every pointing is already more than necessary. What you're looking for is what's looking. What you're seeking to become is what you've always been. What you're trying to find is what's never been lost. This doesn't require any special knowledge, any particular practice, any specific experience. It doesn't require understanding Gnostic cosmology or mastering esoteric teachings. It's simpler than simple, more obvious than obvious, more present than presence itself. Beyond all the teachings about Demiurges and Archons, beyond all the stages of awakening and recognition, beyond even this ultimate understanding of there being no trap, there's just this simple, obvious, always present reality that needs no name, no description, no attainment. It's what's reading these words right now. It's what's always been here, what will always be here, what can never not be here. If this video truly resonated with you, if you felt that deep, unsettling recognition within yourself, then let me know. Leave a comment below and tell me I understood it.